Welcome to July's Cyber Briefing. I'm Lauren Frickel, Marketing Manager here at CynergisTek. A bit of quick housekeeping before we begin. There are a few buttons on the left side of your screen that we'll use today. Use the chats button to engage in conversation with the entire group, and use the Q&A button to post any questions you have for our speakers or any questions in general. We will address those questions during the Q&A segment at the end of this briefing, which is after Dave's presentation on PAM, Privileged Access Management. For any of you who are new, as a heads up, this briefing is being recorded and will be available to stream here in this Eventry platform by the end of the day. And for those of you who would like to look back at previous recordings or slide shares, we will be sending a follow-up email with those links soon, but we'll also drop a link in the chat right now to access those. And also, if you're looking to earn Chime CEU credits, details for claiming those credits, including a downloadable event agenda, is also at the bottom of the page in the link that I am about to drop. So now, before I turn the mic over, I ask that our audience remain muted. Keep your cameras off until we get to the Q&A segment. So let's start today's session. Mac, turning it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Lauren, and welcome everybody to our month. First of all, I want to say thank you to Lauren and her team for not only putting these things together for us each month, but also the work that they did to help those of you who can take advantage of those Chime CEUs, being able to do that. And I know she's also working on CEUs with some other organizations to see if we can get those approved as well. So that as you take an hour out of your time to spend with us, that you actually get the extra benefit of something that goes towards your professional certifications. So good work, Lauren and the team for doing that. All right, well, let's get started today. If you can go to the next slide. So I'm joined, you all know Dave, or those of you who have been on before know Dave Bailey, who runs our security services organization, and Dave's going to be on talking about PAM, as Lauren said. But the person that you see in the middle there that you might not know is Katie Bertrand, who is our new manager of privacy consulting and staffing. And she was one of our privacy consultants for quite a while, and she's now been recently promoted to actually manage that group of folks, which are actually getting much busier lately, which is a good thing. But Katie's joining us today for the first time, and she's going to be talking about GDPR and, more importantly, answering some of the common questions that we get asked with respect to GDPR and who it applies to and out there. And hopefully she'll be able to answer some of those questions for you as well. Next slide. So as always, I'm going to start off with some current facts and stories, things that are happening out there that hopefully you are already aware of, or if not, hopefully you will take something away from. And that is that, last month I talked about the advanced persistent threat groups that are out there, and the fact that small organizations are just as likely to get hit by an APT group as large organizations. These are individuals or organizations that tend to be aligned with state governments or professional hacker groups, organized crime, if you will. And the reason these folks are so dangerous is because they have the resources to carry out the attacks that they launch. And more importantly, they have the research and the capability to do research on the individuals or the targets that they go after. So typically, when an advanced persistent threat group comes after you, they're not just randomly finding you on the internet. Typically you are an organization that for some reason or another, whether it was information they saw on the dark web, or whether it was just a targeted attack with respect to healthcare organizations, there was something that brought them to your doorstep, and you can be pretty confident that they've done research on your organization and your environment before they actually launch their attack. So they're not just the random attacker that we see causing other problems, and that's why they become particularly worrisome, if you will. We saw vulnerabilities really account for the majority of the attacks that occurred at first part of this year. 82%. When you think about that, that's an incredibly high number. When you realize that these are issues in our environment that are either the result of a patch that's not been applied, or a configuration that hasn't been applied, or a functionality that hasn't been enabled, something that we had control over, something that we could have done to avoid what happened. And so, this is, and I call it the Achilles heel of IT, because that's really what it is. I mean, and unfortunately, in times where IT resources are stressed because either they don't have enough or there's too much going on in terms of ongoing projects, etc. The routine, what I call the routine housekeeping chores that need to be performed on a regular basis in terms of cleaning things up, making sure configurations are where they need to be, making sure that things are getting patched in a timely manner, making sure that we're paying attention to those systems or services or applications that are becoming unserviceable because they're hitting that point in their life that they're no longer supported, et cetera, et cetera. All those things that we have to do that unfortunately sometimes get pushed aside when the more pressing or more operationally focused things come up. We need to understand that those are still the things that are creating the greatest problems for us from an attack perspective and a threat perspective. I wanted to talk about credentials a little bit this week, because obviously we're gonna talk about credentials when we talk about PAM with Dave. But credentials absolutely are incredibly important and valuable things to attackers. And there are all sorts of attacks that they will launch, whether it's credentials that have been compromised, or a technique called credential dumping, or reusing credentials. This is unfortunately the case where people reuse a password over and over again, or they use their system password for an application password, or username, or they use their corporate account for a private account. And unfortunately, when those things get compromised, or when one of your credentials gets compromised, there are organizations out there that take that set of credentials and then apply it across the board to other different services to see if that credential will work. And if you've reused it and they find where you reused it, then all of a sudden they're in that account and they can actually access information that's related to you, or do something with that account that you would prefer that they not do. So reusing IDs and passwords is never a good thing. Having passwords, user IDs and passwords on critical applications without multi-factor authentication, where they have to have a second factor, and strengthening those credentials is also something that we need to really give some thought to. But we need to pay attention to credentials, and you're going to hear Dave talk about that quite a bit. Ransomware is still very much alive and well, as I'm sure everybody knows. The research that we've seen come out lately is talking about how the new ransomware groups that are emerging look very much like older groups that we've seen in the past. Meaning, when you look at the way the malware that they use, or the attack profile that they use, etc., it very much is patterned after or resembles an old attack pattern, which has led a lot of researchers now to believe that really what's happening is a lot of these ransomware groups are beginning to change their identities over time. One, to throw off the people that are trying to catch them or trying to pursue them, and make it harder to recognize who they are. But it just seems like, as you heard the old saying, what's old is new again. It seems that a lot of things are just being reused over and over and over, and they're still finding ways to get in, and they're finding organizations that haven't addressed those issues previously, and so they become victim to it. Next slide. Lauren, next slide. Okay. So this is just some of the big events that happened in June that have kind of a far-reaching impact, if you will. Roughly 142 million MGM Grand Resort guests were victimized again. And what this shows you is that the fact that you were victimized once doesn't mean it can't happen again. This first breach happened back in 2019 when these accounts were breached during a breach at that time. But just this past month, the attackers who perpetrated the initial breach, if you will, posted all of that data on an app called Telegram and provided it free to anybody who wants to use any of that account information to run attacks. So all of those victims of that original attack back in 2019, 3 years ago, are now having to deal with it all over again and pay attention to what's going on in their information. General Motors announced it was a victim of a credential stuffing, causing clients to lose reward points. Again, bad guys going after somebody's credentials, and they're particularly interested in folks who are reusing credentials or not using strong credentials, and getting hold of lists and then running it against other systems in order to be able to identify, which is what happened here, and then to get in and be able to steal the points that people have put together under General Motors. Nearly 2 million patients at more than 30 medical facilities affected PII, Social Security numbers, medical information, insurance, etc., and have all joined a class action lawsuit. So once again, the whole idea behind these things is these are events that just keep affecting us. And right now, in the current economic environment that we're in, where a lot of organizations are already stressed with what's going on with the economy, the last thing we need is, one, to be dealing with these very costly breaches and the downtime that's associated with that. But more importantly, things like this, where you have a class action lawsuit that just eats up countless dollars in defending an organization against these kinds of claims. But that's the reality, and this is why we need to do an even better job of paying attention to those routine housekeeping chores as it relates to maintaining our environment, and then absolutely rebuilding our environment out more robustly as it relates to our ability to detect and respond to these incidents to mitigate the effects before they turn into things like what we're seeing here. And in fact, we had one hospital that we work with that this past 2 weeks ago had an incident, but actually were able to stop the incident before the bad guys were able to, one, detonate their payload, or two, encrypt their data or extract any of it. And it was all because they were able to detect it early and then to take the steps to stop the attack before it could actually occur. That's where you want to be in your program. Next slide. This is something that I thought probably you should all be aware of. If you're not, this was an announcement that came out from the CISA and the FBI. This is regarding a North Korean APT group that is using what's called the Maui Ransomware. And as you said here, kind of tongue in cheek, it's not a vacation. But this is a particular ransomware attack that is absolutely focused on healthcare and public sector organizations. This is also a ransomware attack that is different in that it doesn't just randomly target data across the board. It actually targets specific files in the environment that they're going after, which makes it even harder to detect. And it doesn't provide in many cases a ransom note. So the person doesn't even know that their files have been encrypted or have been extracted, or an automated process like a lot of the ransomware does for acquiring the encryption keys. So if you haven't read this notice by the FBI, CISA, and the FBI, please do it. And if you haven't applied those indicators of compromise that they've identified, please do that as well, and understand that this is a very specific attack against healthcare by an organized APT group that is state sponsored by North Korea. Next slide. I brought this up because I read a very interesting couple of articles this month with respect to ransoms, and it just doesn't pay. When you look at the facts and going back and looking at all the cases that have occurred in the last couple of years, 92% of those who paid didn't get all of their data back, and 29% couldn't recover more than half of their data following encryption. Also, 80% of those who paid a ransom were attacked again. 40% of those paid more the second time than they paid the first time. Only 42% of the payments resulted in complete restoration of data. 54% reported issues persisted, and some data was corrupted after being encrypted. And last but not least, interestingly enough, 78% of those who did not pay were able to restore their data fully without paying a ransom or giving in to the attacker's demands. This is just information for you to consider, but the fact of the matter is that paying the ransom doesn't necessarily guarantee you anything, and it certainly doesn't do anything to diminish the attacker's willingness to do this, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the end of your pain, so to speak, just because you pay the ransom. Not only that, there's also the laws out there with respect to paying the ransom and who you can pay the ransom to, and you really need to be aware of those, or have somebody who is, and make sure that you don't get crosswise with the federal government with respect to paying a ransom to a group that you shouldn't be paying it to. Next slide. I throw this out, I'm not going to go over it, but just a reminder, the situation in Europe is still ongoing. And even though it is seems to somewhat quieted down, anything is still possible. And we need to make sure that we are still paying attention to the things that we've been paying attention to. And if we see anything unusual with respect to Eastern Europe in our systems, we should report it immediately. Next slide. So that brings me to my good friend Chesty Puller, and that first bullet up there says, "Halt! What's the password?" whispered the sentry, aiming his weapon at the movement in front of them. And I'm old enough to remember that, because when I was a young Marine, that's exactly what we had. Every time we sent troops out in front of us, or anytime we were facing an unknown, we had passwords, and they changed on a regular basis throughout the day. And you had to know that password to get back in without getting shot. And so it was a big deal. In the purpose of that, obviously, was to make sure that we knew who was coming back in, who was coming into our lines, and whether or not they were friend or foe. That's all about understanding, being proactive in your defenses, and understanding and anticipating that there are bad guys out there that are trying to get in. GDPR, which Katie's going to talk about next, anticipates that you know who you have in your system and where their data lives if this rule applies to you. That's really important. That means having good management or oversight of the data that is appropriate here in your environment. And PAM, we're going to talk about PAM, which is a way to eliminate those persistent credentials and get back to that place where that credential is only good for the time that it's out there, and it has to have a second factor, and it's appropriately monitored and audited so that we know exactly who's using it and what they're doing and what they're allowed to do. And PAM actually helps us in other ways, not just controlling those credentials and helping us with defending against external threats, but it also helps us with that ex-employee who perhaps has worked in IT and has left. Oftentimes their accounts aren't disabled as quickly as they should be, but it doesn't matter. The minute they're gone and their account is disabled, they can't get back into that solution and use their access. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie, who's going to talk about GDPR, and then she's going to hand it off to Dave, and then we'll come back and answer questions. Katie, take it away.
Thank you, Mac. Get my camera situated here. As Mac said, I'm Katie Bertrand with CynergisTek. Just a little bit of background about me. I've been with CynergisTek for about 4.5 years now. Prior to CynergisTek, I worked as a HIPAA privacy officer for 10 years in 2 different healthcare spaces. I worked for 5 years at a hospital health system as a HIPAA privacy officer. And then I spent another 5 years as a privacy officer for a national lab and pharmacy company. And so I'm happy to be here to talk to you about the General Data Protection Rule, or commonly or even affectionately referred to as GDPR. And so we'll start off with a little bit of history or basics about the GDPR. As you can see here, it took effect in May of 2018. 2 things here. The goal of the European, it was a regulation implemented in the European Union. The goal of the European Union here was to sort of help organizations streamline a little bit to help them when they're operating in Europe, if they're collecting or processing the residents of Europe's data, but also to afford the individual or the data subject with certain rights and certain control over whether their data is collected at all. And if it is, some control about being able to revoke that collection and so on. So next slide, please, Lauren. So here we're going to talk a little bit about the organization's ability to collect or what they may collect, where the organization may be. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera. I'm having some technical difficulties today. So where the organization may be and where whose data this applies to. So two really important things here, 2 important themes here. The organization can be anywhere. If they're operating in the European Union, GDPR may apply to the organization. But the second piece of this is that if the organization is collecting or processing the data of individuals residing in the European Union. I'm going to repeat that second piece again, residing in the European Union. Now, there's some debate out there in the privacy and compliance world about what this means. What does residing mean? Does this apply only to citizens in Europe? Does it apply to me if I'm a US citizen and I'm living temporarily in Europe? And so the common or the popular answer to that is it is to any individual residing in the European Union, whether or not you have European Union citizenship. So that's something that's important to remember. A quick note here about what personal data means as far as the GDPR is concerned. It's a very broad definition of personal data. It's probably one of the most broad definitions I've come across working in privacy for 15 going on 15 years now. Some of the information you can see here on the slide is common, especially to those of us who are in the healthcare space and who have obligations under the HIPAA privacy rule. The common identifiers such as names and numbers. But what's unique here is that it also includes things like location data, which is a hot topic these days, particularly in the US, and other online identifiers and so forth. It's very broad, and it has been interpreted by enforcement authorities in Europe to mean anything that can identify the subject of the data. So let's talk a little bit about enforcement. Next slide, please, Lauren. Next slide, please, Lauren. Thank you. So you can see here from a fines perspective, it's pretty steep. It's probably the biggest fines that I've seen, particularly in the data privacy world, up to 4% of your annual. I'm sorry, previous slide, Lauren. The enforcement slide.
It's there, Katie. I think you're lagging. It's on.
So up to 4% of your global annual revenue, or 20 million euro, whichever is greater. We don't see data privacy fines in the US like this, and certainly the Office for Civil Rights has not levied any such fines against healthcare providers. The enforcement authority in Europe are what are called data protection authorities. They're designated typically by country, but sometimes by region. Data protection authorities have, of course, authority for enforcement. They also have authority to interpret the GDPR, with regulations. As we know, even here in the US, sometimes authorities interpret things slightly differently, and that's true in the European Union as well. And then lastly here, as far as cases being levied against any sort of US companies, it's largely focused on big tech. You can see some examples here: Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, all got charged with or levied fines by data protection authorities in Europe. And a lot of these cases happened shortly after the enforcement date in May of 2018. There's lots of information online you can read about as far as those cases go. So next slide, please, Lauren. We'll talk a little bit about what compliance obligations look like. Next slide, Lauren.
Katie, I think that you're a little behind.
So
we are
from
on
a
the
compliance perspective, here are some high-level compliance requirements for those of you privacy and compliance. I'm sorry, what was that, Lauren? So the compliance requirements here on this slide for privacy and compliance officers, some of this is going to look very familiar to you. Of course, there's a notice component. There's a requirement for individual rights and how the individual may request those rights and how you respond to them. Depending on the size of the organization, you may also have a requirement to designate a data protection officer. It's a similar concept of the HIPAA privacy officer, where you have obligations for the privacy program. There's a training and breach component to GDPR. But what's a little bit unique about GDPR is the last two bullets here. So the privacy by design and what's called privacy impact assessments, or PIAs. So privacy by design is a privacy theory or concept in which you think about privacy first. When you go to implement a new technology system, for example, or maybe you're making changes to an existing system or process or practice. The idea is that privacy personnel, compliance, legal, privacy are involved in the conversation at the start. because you want to make sure that you recognize if the system or practice or process includes personal data, that conversation is happening up front. How is it going to affect how we respond to rights? How is it going to affect the data generally? Now, I know if there are any privacy and compliance folks in the audience, you're probably thinking to yourself, yeah, right, I'm usually the last one to know. And I've been there, I understand that. But for GDPR purposes, the idea is that you're among the first to know and you're part of that initial conversation. Privacy impact assessments, or PIAs, are sort of mini risk assessments. And the requirement here is if you're implementing a new system or practice or process, that you document any sort of risk that may be identified with the new system, practice, or process. So you're documenting what data is impacted by this change, how much data is impacted by this change, where is the data, and what is the risk, if any, to that data with these changes or new implementations. And so the last concept that we have here is a mechanism called about transferring data outside of the EU. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, of course I would use encryption, and of course you would, but this isn't really a concept around the technology. This is a concept of, the authorities in the EU and residents of the EU feel like the GDPR is a very strong and powerful piece of legislation around data protections. And so the idea of transferring their data outside of the EU, where those protections may no longer exist, is the issue here. And so generally speaking, if you are subject to GDPR and you're going to transfer data outside of the EU, there are certain mechanisms you have to implement in order to do that. And the examples here: binding corporate rules, which are essentially policies and procedures, standard contract clauses, similar concept of business associate agreements, but not quite the same. And then, of course, consent of the individual. If you have the individual's consent to do the transfer, then, of course, you have authority to do that. So a couple of things about compliance, though, guys, is that, one, you shouldn't think of GDPR compliance as, okay, well, if I comply with GDPR, then I meet requirements for HIPAA privacy compliance. That's absolutely not the case. Even though there are similarities between the two rules, there are differences. And so the goal here is to navigate compliance with both. And I know privacy and compliance professionals in our audience understand this. This is something we do every day, right? It's navigating how to comply with both, and also leveraging what you may have implemented for HIPAA privacy or GDPR to comply with the other rule, right? And it is possible to do that. And certainly if you have questions about that or need assistance with that, we have some expertise here to help you with that. So next slide, Lauren. So lastly here, we want to talk, you may be thinking to yourself, I'm a healthcare provider, I'm in the US, does GDPR really apply to me? Well, the answer here is unfortunately not an absolute. It depends on the situation. You certainly want to have a conversation with your privacy and compliance and legal folks, but just some high level information for you here in situations that may apply to you or may not apply to you. It's pretty strong probability that if you're marketing to any resident or data subject in the EU, that you probably do have GDPR compliance obligations. The same goes for if you have locations in Europe, you may have GDPR compliance obligations. This last bullet here, though, is something that I learned from my own personal experience. I did a short-term contract as a data protection officer for a device manufacturing company here in the US. And part of that data protection officer duty was a gap analysis for GDPR. And, device manufacturer, of course, they're doing research. pretty robust research program. And as part of that assessment, I discovered that not only were we conducting research in Europe and had an actual location in Europe, but we were also recruiting participants in the EU to participate in the research. So if you are at an organization where you have a pretty robust research program, you might want to take a look at, if you're doing research, where are you recruiting participants from, and also, look at your contracts, your research contracts, particularly sponsored research. Where is the research being conducted? And if you find out that, you may have locations in Europe or recruiting residents of the EU, probably chances are pretty good that you have some GDPR compliance obligations under those circumstances. And lastly here, folks, the idea, I think probably the biggest question that most healthcare providers have is, I operate in the United States. I'm at a community hospital, or that I have a practice in the community. I don't operate outside of this community, but someone from Europe came into my facility needing services, and we, of course, provided the services. Does that mean I'm obligated under the GDPR? The answer to that is a pretty strong, probably not. If you're not marketing to European residents, this is just one of those things where someone from Europe was here vacationing or traveling, and you provided services, your obligations under GDPR probably don't exist under that circumstance. And so that concludes my brief discussion on GDPR. I'd like to turn the mic over to Dave Bailey, who is going to talk to us about implementing privileged access management.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Dave Bailey, Vice President of Security Services. Glad I could be here today to talk to you about implementing privileged access management. Go ahead, next slide, please. If there's anything that I would say that you can take away from this presentation, there's really three things of this briefing. It's hopefully you can understand the risk and business case for PAM. I think the second and most important thing is that it's all about the preparation to be able to implement PAM, and PAM does require a change in people, process. This is not just a security tool. This is not something that you would just be able to implement overnight. So those are the takeaways, and let's dive into the presentation. All right, what are the business drivers? Well, I think the main key for the main two business drivers with privileged access management is we have an adversary that is executing disruptive cyber attacks. If you look at right now, the top 10 malware families that are causing disruption throughout the world, 8 of those 10 specifically have descriptions about using credentials as a part of their attack vector. They're either trying to steal credentials, harvest the credential, or use it as a part of their attack chain. As we know, part of what PAM and the benefits that PAM can provide to you is, you want to be able to reduce that attack surface. So it is really needed in order to reduce that overall threat and risk to your organization, because it can provide the right level of safeguard to be able to secure that extremely critical asset that you have to operate and maintain, which is that identity, which is that credential. And there's another financial component too that we're certainly seeing, is that there is could be a potential major financial added pressure with the cyber insurance carriers that are requiring privileged access management as part of their review and their underwriting process. So we are seeing, not only do we see premiums go up, but we're seeing that the demand to have this capability in your environment is much needed. Next slide. All right. I first and foremost want to start out by saying I think the solutions that are out in the industry today for privileged access management, they're highly capable and they're highly effective. There's a lot of great technologies out there, and they can perform that function of being able to minimize that attack surface, discover, manage, audit, put you in compliance, reduce your overall risk. What I think is important to note is that, when the solution providers are selling you on the services and you're learning about what those services are, for the most part, they are talking to you about their capabilities in that ideal enterprise. If you look at those solutions and what they can do in that ideal enterprise, they're fast, they're agile, highly capable, and really can do the things that are needed. Unfortunately, what we find is that the picture on the top right is really the actual enterprise, and what you find is that it sometimes can be very difficult to get that race car to hum at the ideal enterprise experience without maybe fixing some potholes and patches and smoothing that road out. So one of the things that we want to talk about are what are the things that can help prepare so you can smooth that surface out and ultimately get your PAM experience to the ideal enterprise. Next slide. All right, we're going to talk about what do I mean about preparation? 6 areas we're going to touch on briefly. Assess your environment, identify all account types and role-based access, entitlements, reviews, understand vendors. I think it's extremely important, and then understand the support and operational roles. Go ahead, next slide. Key things about assessing your environment. PAM requires full system development lifecycle management. And what I mean by that is, run it like you would run any other enterprise system that goes through your environment, obtain business leader champions, discover all of the things that you need to identify, build your plans and execute them. As I can stress, that there's a lot of things inside of folks' organizations where they look at things that are known as security tools. And while PAM is a security tool, it is not a tool that won't have operational impact to the organization. So, treat this as a full system lifecycle, champion it with business leaders and run it through a process that allows you to overall plan and execute. Go ahead, next slide. Identify all account types and role-based access. As you know, the landscape of accounts that resides inside of enterprise, can be quite large. If you look at how organizations have grown and adapted over the years, that you're going to have service accounts and domain accounts and local accounts and application and user, etc. It's extremely important to be able to understand what you have in your environment. And if you don't have a good picture of what that looks like, it's extremely important to get that picture before you try to implement, the type of privileged access management, that's there. You want to be able to make sure you have roles documented and you understand what the principle of least privilege is. What's important about PAM is that, you're going to enter into an environment where before PAM, you've got an account that's active that has privilege, and that account can be used for good. It can also be used by a threat actor in order to do harm to you. PAM reverses that and it vaults it, it puts it away, and you only use it when it's required. And that use allows you to monitor, to audit, to control it, to put all the appropriate safeguard around it. So it's really, really important you understand how each of the roles that you have in your organization are managed. And go ahead, next slide. This leads into entitlement. One of the things in our experience, certainly dealing, within the healthcare industry, and I'll frankly say this is all industries. Generally speaking, you have, unless you're truly in a role-based access environment, you're going to have situations where users have more entitlement that they need. Most organizations, they have entitlement creep, it grows, and unless you have processes in place that review that entitlement, that remove that entitlement, and you work with your applications and your systems to make sure that least privilege is there, you're going to want to get your arms around what that entitlement creep looks like. And certainly if you don't have sound audit practices in place, you want to make sure that you can, if you don't have them in place before PAM, know that during this process, you're going to want to implement those audit practices. And it's going to be really important to make sure that, I would conduct an audit. I would conduct entitlement review before I would go and implement, that type of technology in the environment. Next slide. Review the structure. What type of domain do you have? Is it single? Do you trust other domains? What does your organizational unit, management look like? When is the last time that you did a health check, with your AD environment? Is it running the latest technology? Is it patched? Is it running optimal? Because if it is running optimal, those great technologies that can provide that privileged access management solutions can start to run, very optimally once you put them in the environment. So I would definitely make sure that you review that Active Directory environment, make sure it's ready and capable, and you can do a lot of cleanup. I know that if this is not something that's regularly done inside an organization, that this can be a pretty big hurdle to get over. So I would put the focus on it, and the more focus you can put on it before you install PAM, I think the more successful implementation you can have. Go ahead, next slide. All right, I'm just going to talk briefly about vendors. I think from an operational support and workflow perspective, this is one of the challenging areas. Not only do you have to be concerned about how users access your environment, not only with inside the network, but from outside the network. Now you have, potentially privileged users that are going to access that environment, whether it's from the inside or the outside, and how you go about operationalizing that. So it's important to know what vendors are accessing, how they're accessing the environment, and how they're going to be integrated into this vaulting type solution. I can guarantee you're going to have to review, operational and support workflows with your IT, service support, application support, and then, look at how are you doing approvals, how are you doing audits, and be able to provide that support awareness as you implement these processes. Once again, this is not something that you generally would just flip a switch and you have privileged access management. It's going to take a hard look at those areas. Next slide. And then the last thing I want to point out here, I think overall, update and train overall support processes. And I mentioned it, briefly with vendors just before, but really this is the whole organization. What does PAM really mean to you? If you have a good PAM implementation, you're going to have good defined privileged account policy that's governed by policy. So you'll have that. You'll have processes in place that allow you to discover and monitor privileged access. You're going to implement things like minimal necessary, least privilege type access to systems and assets and capabilities within your environment. You'll have the ability to detect abnormal behavior. So there'll be processes around how do you respond to that? How is now PAM integrated into your incident response capabilities? And then, what changes you have to make to your overall reviews from an account perspective, entitlement perspective, and audit perspective. So I know there's a lot there. I also know that it's PAM is a really, really good technology. It's a technology and capability that really can help you reduce your risk. It is extremely important knowing the type of threats that are there today. I think, as Mac pointed out in the beginning, with the overall threat, we're just seeing the types of attacks. Almost every single one of them has to do something with a password that was compromised, a credential that was compromised, and some threat actor, having that ability to go undetected inside your environment and cause disruptive harm. So this, along with, if you add privileged access management, along with multi-factor authentication, along with good password policy, these are things that can really reduce your overall attack surface. So that's all I have for today. I'd be happy to take any questions at this time and have open discussion about this. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Dave. And Katie, if you would join us again as well for this part of the presentation. And I would like to open it up now to the audience to ask questions if you have any. And Lauren, so if you would just alert me, we'll do that.
Yeah, we do have one question already in from a friend over at Valley Health System. And that is, how does, if at all, GDPR impact U.S. providers' relationship with their EU vendors or third parties? Who may have access? Yep, I think there's a couple questions. So first, how does, if at all, GDPR impact U.S. relationship with their EU vendors? And then who may have access to our data of U.S. patients? Do we have any responsibility or obligation to verifying third-party vendors' compliance with GDPR?
So I think to rephrase that question a little bit differently is, if you have I think what we're asking is, if we have a vendor, an EU vendor that has access to our patient information, what are our responsibilities? Katie?
Katie, are you there?
So I had to turn my camera off. I'm having some technical difficulties over here. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll tell you what, we're gonna, I'm assuming that question came from Miroslav. And so buddy, we're gonna get you the answer, and we'll actually communicate it to everybody else that's on the call today as well. Katie's obviously having some problems there. So Lauren, what's the next question?
We don't have any questions, any other additional questions at this time, but please feel free to ask in the Q&A box.
No questions. I'm surprised. Okay. Well, if there's no question, you can think about questions while I wrap it up in a few minutes, and we can always take a question and while I'm doing that. What we try to do is tie these things together, and I try to tie together the information that I talk about in the front of the presentation with what we're going to be the topics that we're talking about later in the presentation, so that those things are connected. And so when I look across all of the research that goes on out there to identify what's going on that perhaps is related to these various things, as Dave, I think so accurately stated, there's no doubt about it. Credentials are absolutely one of those things that are creating the most havoc with respect to cyber incidents, because once a cyber actor gets inside your environment and gets their hands on a set of elevated privileges or administrative privileges, where they can actually change things, make things happen, download payloads, encrypt things, etc. That's when they can really do the most damage. And so, there's lots of things that we need to do. Obviously, we talked about the housekeeping in terms of making it difficult for them to be able to get in the first place, and for them to be able to compromise different assets. But it also, we need to think about how we actually configure things, understanding that it isn't just about servers and workstations and endpoint devices. It's also about that connective tissue between those things, those routers, those switches, et cetera, that also need to be tightened down and configured properly, so that as an attacker, not only do I have to exploit the system that I maybe got access to, but now I've got to find a way to break every other system in between to get from there to whatever else it is I'm trying to get to. And without a set of elevated privileges or access that can give me the ability to do some of those things, it just gets exponentially harder for me to perpetrate a successful attack, if you will. And that's really where you want to get to at the end of the day. You want to be in a position where it is extremely difficult for an attacker to take advantage, so that you have an opportunity or the chance to recognize or to detect what's going on before they have the ability to hurt you and to do real damage. And the harder they have to work, and the more noise they have to make while they're doing it, and the more things that they have to try to get around or to defeat in order to get to where they're trying to get to, the more likely it is that you're going to detect them, that you're going to notice what's going on, or that you're going to see something that doesn't make sense, and you're going to be able to respond to it. And so that's really where you want to get to. With respect to these, as Dave talked about, in the thing that we see, two things that we see most often with people who are trying to implement a PAM solution effectively, or a vault, if you will, is one, they don't have a really good, clean Active Directory environment. Meaning, Active Directory has grown over the years. It's been added to, it's been modified, et cetera, but nobody has ever gone back and cleaned it out. Kind of like that closet, right? That just keeps adding clutter. You've got to do that. You've got to clean up that Active Directory architecture, if you will, and optimize it if you want these other solutions to work in an optimized way as well. And the second part of it is really understanding all of your accounts that are out there, not just privileged accounts or user access accounts, but service accounts and accounts between systems, for instance, that just the system uses, that one system uses to talk to another system. We tend to forget about a lot of those other accounts when we're doing some of these things, but all of that needs to be cleaned up and put in order. And when we do that, when we do that, and we get our house in order, and we clean up that Active Directory, and we clean up our accounts and our privileges, et cetera, now all of a sudden those PAM things, like PAM solutions and other solutions for that matter, work so much better and are so much more effective. And that's the thing that you need to understand. And that's typically something that you do yourself, or you have someone help you do, but it's typically not something that necessarily the solution vendor does for you, because typically their solution is going to work the way they say it's going to work, but they assume that you've gotten that environment ready for that solution before it gets put in there. And all too often that is not the case. So that's a very important piece of this, and that's the part we wanted to focus on today. Not the technologies themselves. Lauren, did we get any questions while I was talking?
We did not, Mac.
All right. Well, listen, everybody, thank you very much for joining us in July. And as you can see, in August, we're gonna be talking about things related to supply chain, as well as actually integrating audits into your assessments and your security and privacy programs, and the difference between what an audit can do for us and what an assessment does for us, as opposed to say what testing does for us, and understanding those relationships and how to get the most out of those things, so that as we're doing them, we're not doing things that are redundant or things that are not meaningful, but things that actually complement one another in our overall program. And again, if you are eligible for the CEU credits that Lauren talked about at the beginning of the presentation, please make sure you get that link so you can take advantage of that. And hopefully by next month, we'll have some other organizations that will be recognizing the cyber briefings for credit as well. So with that, we sign off and thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.